My name is Gary Czar, and I am a proud member of the Municipal Arts Society. I think everybody's quite happy today. I don't know if it's because of the survey. Everybody seems quite excited. I remember when I visited Bhutan, the king sort of had an index called the gross national happiness. So I'm wondering if New York is going to have that soon. I'm here to introduce a wonderful panel to discuss this livability survey. We have top people from journalism, the academy, social activism, and urban planning. And I think they're going to bore down a little bit based on Vin's discussion about what does this really mean and what are the different aspects, what can we learn from this study. The moderator is Allison Tachi, and I'd like to invite Allison to come up if your chair is here. Allison is the president of Time Out North America. That includes Time Out New York. All of you, I'm sure, subscribe and get it online, look at it online. I never realized that Time Out New York has 1.2 million unique visitors each month, and that's a lot of people. And Allison oversees all of Time Out's print and online initiatives in North America. Our first panelist is Paul Steely-White. He's the executive director of the nonprofit, Paul, why don't you come up, advocacy group Transportation Alternatives. Paul has led New Yorkers through many debates, published many studies on urban planning, public space, the creation of bike lanes, and new car parking strategies. So thank you for being here. Robert McNulty, our next panelist, has a really interesting career. He's the president of the Partners for Livable Communities in Washington, D.C. He's commuting weekly to Oxford to teach a class, he told me. So he's quite an expert and has published 5 books on the livability of urban America. A very varied career. He started as an archaeologist in colonial Williamsburg, worked at the Smithsonian, the General Services Administration, and the National Endowment for the Arts. And our fourth panelist is Mary Rowe. She's an urban animator with experience working in philanthropy and community development in Canada and the US. Mary just recently joined MAS after several years working in New Orleans in support of various forms of self-organization since those terrible storms in 2005. Now I'll turn it over to Allison. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. How's the sound out there? Everyone can hear all right? Gary and I are both Brooklynites, so we're happy to be here. We're apparently a little less happy than everyone here in Manhattan, but nonetheless happy to be here. And I'm honored to be asked to moderate this panel of these wonderful experts who are going to offer us a little deeper insight. I, like Vin, read through the results in the past 48 hours and was a little bit astonished by the happiness factor. And so we're here to drill down a little bit and talk about how do we define livability and what does it mean that 24% of the people would move given the choice. Where are those people and why do they feel that way? We're going to talk a little bit about the quality of the public transportation and how that contributes. And I think I'll let the panelists speak for themselves. I'll start with Mary. Introduce yourself and talk a bit more about your perspective.
I feel like I have my back to you. Are you guys? If I move the seat, I'm sure some techie's going to come out and tell me not to do that. But we'll just try to be expansive here. But I just think, first of all, I want to say something quickly about context. I think we need to remind ourselves that New York isn't just the livability of New York is not just about New Yorkers. It's not just about whether we like living here. It's actually about whether or not this significantly important city to the country is desirable and functioning well. And so I think livability, Bob and I had a bit of a chat about this, is really code for is the city working well? Because this is the economic engine of the country. It drives social innovation, it drives economic innovation. So I think we should just remind ourselves, I think we can be a little, I'm from Toronto, so I have some sympathy for this. We can get a little narcissistic about, you know, we like ourselves, don't we? We like New York. And it's really not just about whether we like living here, it's about whether the city is functioning and whether it has the capacity to do the kinds of things that it needs to do, not just for us who live here, but for the country and for the economy and all the smart things that New York's introduced. So I just want to say that as context. The second thing is I want to pick up on a word you just used. I think this is really about choice. I think that what we're trying to always determine and check and measure and watch is whether or not a city is providing choices. And where it's failing to provide choices is where we see these kinds of livability indexes blipping, because it means that people don't feel they have enough mobility, or they don't have the access to economic opportunity, or they don't have a good school, or they can't get to where they need to be, and choice is compromised. And so I think we always need to be thinking about how do we up choice. And I'm hoping that as this survey rolls out in future years, that we're going to be thinking hard about how do we plumb the data to find out, do people feel they can get where they want to be? Or is there enough cross-pollinating going on across the neighborhoods? It's not just I like where I live. It's that I have some connection with people that live somewhere else, or people that do something different than I do. What one of the presenters talked about, all the serendipitous things that make a city really hum. And I think we can look carefully at the data over time and encourage ourselves to reflect on that it's not just about whether I'm self-satisfied, that it's okay where I am. Just not to be glib, it's hard to not be glib with this data. I didn't see what the New York Times Online said. I bet they were glib. But it's hard to not be glib, but here's the simple thing. If you're white, you're male, you're under 45, and you're making more than 75K, the city's working for you. Duh. So I think we've got to think a little bit about that, about how do we, again, look at it, and Vin implied this, how are we looking at the areas in which it's not working, and for whom is it not working, and when we talk about livability, for whom is it not livable?
Thank you. Bob?
I'd like to focus a bit on some of the boroughs that weren't quite as happy as some of the others, and suggest that New York has the greatest talent pool in the world of institutions and creative people, and perhaps we need to spread some of those resources into the other boroughs to enrich the livability and lives of the people, children, newly arrived immigrants that are living there. I'm taking a look at Gothenburg, Sweden. Metropolitan Gothenburg, Sweden has a metropolitan government, and in all their disparate regions, the goal of government is to place a gem of such beauty and such quality that it creates pride and value. So that in a small region of Gothenburg, the central government of Gothenburg put up $5 million to be the headquarters of the International Watercolor Museum, and into this neighborhood now comes 100,000 visitors a year to discover the neighborhood, and the pride of the neighborhood is that it's also the community room for the neighborhood, a world-famous museum. The Symphony has a fantastic facility in downtown Gothenburg, but there are two gyms in other parts of Gothenburg where the Symphony goes and plays every week. Now, does that exist in the Bronx or in Queens? Does the Metropolitan go to the Bronx? So let's think also of Medellin, Colombia. Medellin is a city that you know has such a reputation for violence and drug, but under a new mayor that is, he brought in world-class architects in some of the very low-income neighborhoods to create a library. Is the library there for shelving books? No, it's to grow people. The library is designed distinctiveness. It's an business incubator. It's a labor force preparedness center. It's a youth mobilization program. Could not that be one of the branches of New York Library in one of the boroughs that's not quite so happy with their quality of life? You have so many great institutions. Could they be more a bit like the Queens Museum with Tom Finkelpearl, which we heard Corona's getting special attention because of its diversity? Well, the Queens Museum has adopted Corona miles away from the museum and is working on healthcare and health insurance. Not a normal museum program, but the creativity of Queens Museum is being applied through a community organizer as part of the museum staff to bring value to this. We see in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Murals program works as an employment and as a labor force preparedness and as a youth development program in many of the blighted neighborhoods, far poorer as a city, less creative than New York, but it's world famous, and now they're exporting the mural program to cities around the world as a community development agenda. So my admonition is to learn from Medellin, learn from Gothenburg, even learn a little bit from Philadelphia, and take your wealth and spread it into the other boroughs so that there's a veneer of excellence in every one of your boroughs that can touch and engage the lives of their citizens. Say, what do you need? Can we help you meet that need?
Paul?
So I'll start with a quick announcement. This Sunday, there's going to be a very happy event in the Bronx called the Tour de Bronx. We've been doing this with the Bronx Borough President's Office for 15 years now. And one of the great lines that our Bronx committee chair, Rich Gans, always likes to say at the beginning of the ride is that, folks, this is not a race, it's a ride. It's about smiles per hour, not miles per hour. And watching Jeanette show those slides of the happy family biking in the bike lane, and then the big result of, hey, guess what? New Yorkers are happy. I'm thinking maybe it's finally time to retire the Ratso Rizzo image in Times Square beating on a cab hood saying, I'm walking here. Okay, now we can walk here. And it's actually quite pleasant, and we're happy as a result. The recent extension of the, well, it's not an extension yet, but pedestrian safety improvements in bike lanes on 1st and 2nd Avenue were recently installed. They're still going in. That street is going to be much safer in the future. It's going to be much easier for people to walk. One of the findings in the study that really surprised me was that if you are Latino, if you are African American, you are twice as likely to think that your neighborhood is not a good place to walk than if you are white. So that told me that in those neighborhoods, we really need to be expanding this public space revolution, these pedestrian safety improvements, and I think it's troubling that 1st and 2nd Avenue, those improvements, stop at 34th Street, and originally the plan was to carry those all the way to Harlem. And so now at our office at Transportation Alternatives, we're getting letters from people saying, hey, where's ours? Where's our pedestrian refuge island? Where's our public plaza? Tom Finkelpearl at Queens Museum of Art is trying, like Dickens, to try to make a public plaza happen in Corona Plaza, probably, as was mentioned by Eddie, the most diverse neighborhood on the planet, probably. But how do you fund the ongoing maintenance and operation of that? At a Bryant Park or Madison Square Park, it's relatively easy. The most booming real estate in New York City right now, as any agent will tell you, is that area right between Union Square and Madison Square, which is really the heart of this public space revolution. Easier to fund maintenance there than in Corona, so some challenges.
Agreed. But I think what Eddie said about asking questions is the most intelligent thing we can do, and that's what MAS is doing, is asking those questions to try to define what makes the city livable. And I don't want to rehash the positivity factor. We've gone through that. And, but I think if you drill down and you look at some of these statistics about who would stay put and who would move, it clearly falls along economic lines. And so that is one of the factors that MAS and the city need to look at to figure out how do we right that lopsided situation. And the safety is one thing that I think also flags up the Bronx. And 31% of Brooklynites who don't feel safe walking in their neighborhoods at night. Bob, you have some thoughts about that, the safety?
No, I'm not from New York, and not really. The interesting thing, though, I can make a comparison. Almost every leading city of the world has a core of high income and institutions and services that are gems of their country and gems of the world. So it's London and Paris and Tokyo and increasingly other places. And yet there are then the outlying neighborhoods or boroughs or regions that sometimes get short shrift, sometimes that don't receive their share of services, whether they're police or whether they're culture or whether they're transportation alternatives. And therefore, this is not a problem of New York, it's a problem of our world. Mm-hmm. That we have such wealth that people that with that wealth wish to be located in the hub, in the center, where there are these rich amenities, rich shopping opportunities, and the interaction with people of their own ilk and kind. And it's the outer suburbs, it's the suburbs of immigrants from North Africa in Paris that are burning their cars and are rioting because they have very little value. So the trend that we need to face as citizens of a world is to ensure that there's some broader distribution of the good life, and livability should be defined by the least advantaged member of your community.
So can I just jump in and say that I think also it has to do with how we help things to be more porous. One of the great challenges of New York is you've got water all around you, so it's difficult to sort of orchestrate in an organic way. But as Bob's suggesting, it happens in cities that aren't challenged by that kind of obstacle as well. But we have different kinds of barriers to letting these kinds of things ooze out. I mean, money oozes out, transportation oozes out. If we can walk, bike, that'll help us. But I think that if we look at the statistics you're suggesting here, it's really telling us that the city is not functioning in an ecological way around income. We're not moving money as effectively and efficiently as I suspect we could if we could create more vehicles to get money out. Just as you were suggesting, you want the cultural amenities to be more porous, to ooze out. And I think that the economic opportunities are the same kind of lens if we think about how do we catalyze that to do that. And maybe we need to start thinking a little less about investing in the core, because it's probably going to happen anyway. And we think hard about how do we do some, what Jaime Lerner talks about, urban inoculation. What are the key kinds of things we could do to catalyze that kind of connectivity of economic transactions?
Well, I think that one of the things that I hear, based on being a timeout for the past decade, is from a lot of the small arts groups and cultural groups, is that they can't afford to bring people to, what used to be that they would bring a performance group to the city for a 2-week or a 1-month run. It's now more like 2 or 3 days based on affordability. They just can't afford to put them up. They can't afford to put up a performance and put them up in hotels. So I think that is a factor. But where is the leadership on it from a cultural standpoint or from the city standpoint to look at something like this and say, why is it so lopsided and how do we achieve that inoculation into the outer regions?
I think the leadership is with the Municipal Art Society.
I think a big part of the solution lies with our city's Economic Development Corporation, EDC. I mean, the old school way of thinking was how do we stoke economic development and jobs? Let's build parking garages. Let's get, big development. Let's get, the East Side Gateway Mall or the, Yankee Stadium. And I think given all the new research that we now have about the relationship between livability and job creation and investment, I think EDC really needs to undergo a revolution, quite frankly, and start to realize that this stuff just isn't window dressing. This is the core of what's going to make New York attractive and get those jobs in the future.
And there are tools available to municipalities. I mean, there are things that we could be doing in the Bronx, for instance, to try to create incentives because the real estate's more affordable. It says the survey supports that. And historically, if you look, the parts of the city that are now extraordinarily dynamic economically were actually low rent districts that enabled smart artists and resourceful people in different kinds of manufacturing, early stuff, to be seated there. And I think part of it is us just paying attention to the fact that the more affordable parts of the city are totally acceptable places to seed this. So that, and we should, those of us that tend to congregate in Manhattan need to be a lot braver about going out and looking at the smart stuff that's happening in the periphery. Lots of smart stuff is happening in that area, those areas.
Let's talk about green spaces for a moment. I was very surprised by this, that so many folks in the outer boroughs felt that there were not enough green spaces or that they did not feel safe in them. I mean, is that a product of, as we were talking earlier, that a lot of these areas that are now being populated and developed were once industrial? And why is the focus not so much on the green spaces in the neighborhoods?
It's interesting that green spaces in a recent survey by one of your speakers coming up later, Joe Cartwright, are seen by many citizens as more valuable economic stimulus and attractors and magnets of holding talented people than sports stadiums, than museums. So therefore, green spaces have immense value. But managing them, animating them, for example, in Austin, Texas, parks in the center of Austin are when school is out in the summertime, and there's a large number of kids that get subsidized meals, sometimes 3 meals a day, and worse in DC are now being provided for low-income people. Well, the parks take on the feeding function during the school being out because kids have to eat every day. They don't take a 3-month holiday during the school break. So the parks hire local women as neighborhood concierges. They serve as a feeding center. They serve as a community mobilization. Why not use some of those value of the green spaces also as feeding and nutrition centers, particularly when school is not in session?
I think what we're seeing here is what New Yorkers for Parks has pointed out very cogently, which is that these neighborhoods have a dearth of parks and green space, and they're not as well maintained. I was lucky enough to see Betsy Barlow Rogers speak the other night, and she mentioned that study about how valuable Central Park is from an economic point of view. It's like $600 billion or something. So this stuff matters. How are we going to get more parks? But I think as critical is how do we get people to the parks we have? Harlem River Park, great new park. People can't get to it. There's been some recent pedestrian safety improvements and some bike lanes. But park access is as important, and I'm really encouraged by the work that the health department is doing in central Brooklyn, Harlem, and the South Bronx on how do we encourage access to these amenities that we already have. Green markets, parks, people should be able to walk and bike to these destinations safely.
And Paul, I'm interested in your point of view with transportation alternatives. Do you think that it's getting, is the happiness factor happening? Is it getting better? I mean, when I look at things like Madison Square Park and Brooklyn Bridge Park, it seems to me that those are huge improvements.
One of the world, greatest practitioners that Jeanette has brought in, Jan Gehl from Copenhagen, the architect, has made it his life's work to figure out what are the parameters of public space that maximize human fulfillment. What maximizes spontaneous interaction, eye contact, facial recognition. I love the speaker who talked about how he, can't go out in New York and not run into someone that he knows. Well, you can actually construct your built environment to facilitate those kinds of interactions. And it has a measurable impact on happiness, absolutely.
Actually, what he said is he keeps running into New Yorkers that he wants to know, which is what I thought was kind of interesting. It wasn't just hanging with his pals. He just keeps bumping into people on the subway that he wants to know. I have an idea. I think there's a smart thing around green space. I think, and there are organizations trying to do this, if you took all the units owned by NYCHA, by the Housing Authority, where there is extraordinary green space. In fact, it's pretty stark when you look at those towers. If you go to Brownsville in Brooklyn, for instance, where Common Ground is doing an extraordinary community revitalization initiative there, that's a great potential to green those spaces, to soften those hardscape edges, and invest in assets that we already own. The city owns them, and we can, with very, I think, reasonable investment, turn those areas into the kind of mixing space, that the public space that Jan Gehl talks about.
Street repair, here's another one that I just pulled out because thought it was interesting, that this is the one place where maybe New Yorkers are a little less happy than the rest of the poll. I don't know if there's anyone that disagrees with that, but Mary, from your point of view on livability?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, I think we're shifting a little bit in our understanding of how where is the obligation to identify these things. So in cities around the country, we're seeing these new apps coming up. Many of you probably use them. See, Click, Fix, Every Block, these kinds of things where I notice something on a street that's not functioning, and then I have an easy mechanism to report it. What's interesting is that it's not just about me putting yet another petition into a city department that doesn't have the resources to respond to me. When do we get to the next stage where we start to engage with each other about how do we collectively do something about what's not working? And in Portland, there's that great project, the City Repair Project, where those guys go in and they take over corners and street intersections and do something and model it for the city. And I think this is an interesting leverage point, because I worry a little bit that we don't want to just turn this into a nagging survey. Oh, there's another thing the city isn't doing well. We need to change our relationship. Yeah, because the streets are ours. I mean, that's what this is all about.
The potholes have been getting better. I mean, the MMR, the Mayor's Management Report, every year reports on a whole variety of metrics. They've gotten really good at focusing on targeting. How are we doing this? Using 311. DOT is much more on top of that than they used to be. But it makes me think about what aspects of happiness, livability, quality of life could also be incorporated into 311 or, the MMR. Why shouldn't the city have an annual survey similar to this, which, how am I doing? Like Ed Koch. So.
Right.
I think that's a small point. We've come a long way because 25 years ago, if not New York, but most cities, the number one problem was dog waste. So we don't have dog waste as a major issue. So
and 100 years ago, it was horse waste.
That's right. We've conquered one of the challenges of a livable city.
Exactly.
And also there is the battle between cars and bicycles and pedestrians.
There's that.
Never...
This morning there was a huge counter protest on Prospect Park West. Luckily, the bikers and families seem to outnumber the naysayers by 20 to 1. But this is no small matter. I mean, we as a bicycling community need to get better about yielding to pedestrians. And I think the more pedestrian-friendly our city becomes, the more bike-friendly it becomes. Getting bikers off the sidewalk into these lovely new lanes, it's a good thing.
And on the variety of entertainment, again, this goes to the outer boroughs. I agree with you, Mary. I think there's a huge opportunity there for cheaper space, and this is something that I think arts organizations should be looking at, is spreading out further into the boroughs.
Yeah, and I think you could even probe that question a bit further away from not just me as a consumer of creative stuff, but am I given the opportunity to generate and create my own experience? And I think we could, because I think that's part of how communities serve themselves, is if they don't have the amenities that they want, then they create them themselves. And they look to their own community and put up their own stuff. That happens organically now.
The big box retail, very controversial and very surprising to me on this survey that fewer people objected to this seemingly in this poll than one would think for the amount of noise that you hear about it. I wonder if this is a perfect storm of that Manhattan has become, I will say, a place for wealthy people, and almost exclusively, and the worst economy since the Great Depression. And I don't know that people that are making less money have the luxury of worrying about things like preserving, local family stores or beautiful buildings when they're really more worried about self-preservation. And that perhaps that is what leads to these results. Your thoughts on that?
I think it's choice. As you said earlier, I think it's good for people to have, these kinds of choices. I don't think that it's an either or. I think it's possible to have mass merchant chains in New York City, not on landmark streets or places where there is like such rich local retail, but some of the recent malls that have gone in, there's really not a lot wrong with them except for the fact that they have way too much parking and you can't walk to them.
For example?
Bronx Gateway Mall, the new mall on the east side, they overbuilt the parking. People aren't using the parking. They're taking the bus and they're walking to these places. Let's get big retail in, but let's make it context sensitive to the neighborhood, and let's make sure that New Yorkers who take the bus and walk and increasingly bike can get there.
It's interesting, some of these, well, they're not quite big boxes. They're sort of larger boxes, are new anchor tenants. For example, Whole Foods in Washington, D.C. anchors a whole area of shops, restaurants, theaters, galleries, both affordable housing and upscale housing. Walmart just 2 days ago announced that they were introducing a new downscale size Walmart that could more easily fit into existing communities. So I think you're going to see that it's not the either or, there's the size and the relationship of height and density and scale and other amenities that fit into a community that is welcomed as opposed to being discouraged.
Mary?
Yeah, I just agree with they've said it all, those guys.
You agree with
They've
all
got
that?
it covered.
Okay. We are going to open it up to questions in just a moment, but I would like to get your definition of livability from your point of view. What you've read in this survey, Mary, what's your takeaway from that?
Well, again, my bias is a city that's livable is a city that's working. And working meaning that it's self-fueling, it's correcting, it has enough resources, it has enough access to the kinds of things that allow it to evolve and thrive. And I think we can see in the survey areas that are identifying that aren't working as well as we would like them to. And then we need to step back and carefully reflect on what are the kinds of appropriate interventions by whom and how that would tweak that to help fuel the city itself to correct itself.
There's about 8 major factors that really determine livability, and it depends upon the times that you're in. So I'd have to say jobs, jobs, jobs is the major factor for most American cities to determine livability. Next to that may be sustainability. If you have a strong environmental, or you have a strong sort of smart growth, or you have a strong, T4, transportation coalition on sustainable. It also may then be the quality of your schools in terms of education and learning, or it may be health and wellness, because the number one employer in most of our cities are healthcare institutions, and that's one of the major expenses. And then it may be also the quality of life, and how, the audit is by, as I mentioned, the least advantaged person, do they have the opportunity of being part of the livability agenda? But the balance changes depending upon the tenor of the times and people's sense of opportunity or sense of fear.
David Brooks had a great article earlier this year about some of the recent happiness research, and one of the recent studies has shown that income and livability and happiness, very strong relationship up to $75,000. Above that, diminishing returns. So I think we all agree that we'd like to see more income equality in New York City because it's so strongly correlated. But we also have to recognize what can we do as public policy advocates. And I think I'm encouraged by Enrique Peñalosa, another Colombian from Bogota.
Now living in Toronto.
Now living in Toronto. He talks a lot about quality of life equality. And you look at the metric in Plan YC about let's put every New Yorker within a 10-minute walk of a park. I think we need more metrics like that.
And I think to continue to attract the people that we want to move to New York City, that's an absolutely critical factor, because I think when they weigh their choices, Manhattan is just not an option for a kid just graduating from college now.
Yeah,
and it's getting further and further and further out in Queens and Brooklyn.
And I don't think you like the idea that a quarter of the population would head out if they had a chance. I think that's a concerning thing. I think we should think. I'd like to probe it more. I don't know if it's just. I don't know if it's just the suburban dream that they want to go and get a lawn and a house. I can't believe it's actually that. To me, it says they don't have enough choice here.
Great. We want to open it up to questions. We got an audience full of New Yorkers here. I can't imagine that they don't have opinions and questions. I think what we've done is put some microphones out, or we'll be putting some microphones out here, for questions.
They're also happy and contented.
Oh, there's a guy
Everybody's
there.
happy.
Come to the
No
microphone.
problem. Yes, here comes one here. And I think what you want to do is line up at the microphone if you have a question for one of the panelists. Yes, sir.
I think several panelists, two panelists, alluded to the need to disperse some of the large cultural institutions into the boroughs. This has been tried, but there are secret cabals that prevent this from happening. Usually it's the powerful and the rich that try to hoard the things in Manhattan. And I'll give you several examples. After World War II, when the United Nations was formed, they wanted to put the UN in Flushing Meadow Park, and Rockefellers brought it back to Manhattan. You may also remember the Sackler wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which was put on Central Park's sacred ground, and they took that ground, and that could have been put someplace else. Then there was the football stadium, which they wanted to put on the west side. Fortunately, that went to New Jersey. At least it didn't go and further concentrate everything there in the center. Our subway system also has been designed to keep everything focused in the center, and attempts at breaking down our transportation system so as to make more cross-town connections between things have also, there's been a study by Pratt University that was just released about how that inhibits growth in the boroughs, because people can't get from one place in the boroughs to another place in the outer boroughs because the connections are all through Manhattan. So there needs to be a decentralization of the transportation system, a decentralization in the minds of the people who are kind of running the show in the city.
Thank you. Anybody disagree with that?
The only little nuance I want to add to that is that I just think we need to be careful that, that Manhattan doesn't turn into this Lady Bountiful of culture. Here we are, we're bringing culture to you. The boroughs have their own cultural amenities and their own cultural assets. And the question is whether or not the resources of those larger, more established, richer institutions could somehow be shared to cultivate amenities in the local boroughs that reflected the interests and the existing assets there. I'm just a little worried we don't get too smug about this.
The last bit the gentleman mentioned about transportation being necessary to knit together the boroughs, that's absolutely true. The survey found, to my surprise, that 93% of New Yorkers, I think, said that they have good access to public transportation. Their experience after they get on that train or bus is probably another matter. But if the question is, how can we facilitate more, downtown development in the boroughs, more borough-to-borough travel, cultural amenities. I'm very encouraged by the DOT's bus rapid transit initiative. Fordham Road in the Bronx operates more like a train line now than a bus line because it's so quick from end to end. So I think, looking at Nostrand Avenue in Brooklyn and some of these other big streets that could be transit corridors with more of this DOT bus rapid transit intervention.
Okay, oh, sorry.
Just a small point. I think if you're talking about enhancing some of the cultural amenities, values in the boroughs, you have to ask the borough citizens what they want. The analogy is that as Harvard expands to the Alston campus, they decided to rebuild the Fogg Museum as a major anchor. At the second public forum, the people stood up and said, "We don't want your goddamn museum here." So I think you need to ask the people what they want.
George Hollis, Institute for Rational Urban Mobility. Sorry to keep the subject on transportation, but we're at the end of the year, we're going to face a very significant fare hike for everybody, which is a good lesson or message. Don't use the buses and subways in New York, because we're making it very clear. We're doubling the price on the Brooklyn Bridge. It'll still be zero. We have a policy that clearly is friendly toward the automobile and hostile to public transit. How does that affect the livability of the city?
Yes.
Does anyone here read Matthew Iglesias? He has a great blog. I can't remember the name of it, but he's a frequent Atlantic contributor. And when one of these other happiness studies came out last year, it showed that American dream of that big McMansion in the suburbs, they thought it was going to make them happy, and they were willing to drive, an hour to work to live there. Turns out, it doesn't really make you happy. And so his thing was, what can we do to reduce that commute and reduce traffic congestion that people experience? And his solution was congestion pricing equals happiness. If we could just I'm sure, I don't think Mayor Bloomberg after that big battle probably believes that. But I think absolutely we need to fund transit more sustainably, and a great way to do that is to equalize the tolls for people traveling to Manhattan. Let's make it happen.
Thank you. Another question?
Yes, hi. I'm Kinshasa Holman Conwell. I'm actually a board member of MAS, and I'm a New Yorker who just happens to live in Washington, D.C. So I relate a lot to the notion that New York should be livable for those people who don't currently live in New York, but will return, I promise. I'm helping to build a museum on the National Mall, so that's the only reason that I would ever leave New York. You all have said some very fascinating things linking the various issues, transportation as it relates to certain boroughs that don't have adequate transportation, park spaces, and folks who either don't feel safe in parks or who don't feel that they have enough parks. You all have made some terrific comments about those folks who are in boroughs other than Manhattan, and about smaller cultural organizations. And as I look at Eddie Torres, who really made his mark in the Bronx before going to the fabulous Rockefeller Foundation. And as you said, the name of Tom Finkelpearl, a great hero of mine, along with a lot of people in this audience, who I would name if I had the time. But I don't have the time to talk about Randy Borshide and other people. But if I did, I would have mentioned them. But connect those dots a little more, even if your area is transportation or parks, of the boroughs other than Manhattan, the cultural assets in those boroughs, in a survey like this. What are the opportunities to connect safety, parks? It's just a very small question, but you're so smart, I'm sure that you can tackle it brilliantly. And thank you for the panel.
Well,
Smart panel?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, really. If you think of a city as a living organism, if you think of it as an ecology, and you recognize that ecologies consist of hubs and then links that link hubs, and we can see that if we just look at our city in that way. And so we know that we've got lots of really good cultural hubs that exist across the 5 boroughs. And I think the challenge now is how do we make more porous that kind of connective tissue. So we don't have the transit the way we need it. We probably don't have the economic relationships that we need. We probably need some new horizontally oriented institutions. We probably need to create some of that, or that bridging capital that Robert Putnam talked about. We probably need to be paying more attention to that. And I think that if we were to, back to the point of the decentralization, I'm a big fan of when in doubt, see if we can decentralize. If we were to kind of think about how do we catalyze those hubs, not just cultural, but economic hubs that exist, and strengthen them, then I think we'd start to see impetus for connection coming from the peripheries. And they'd start reaching out, and then, the rest of us would have to say, okay then, they've knocked on the door enough times, here we are.
You have another question here?
Hi, I'm John Manjit from the Center for Urban Pedagogy in Brooklyn. I have a question about park funding in an era of permanent budgetary constraint. I'm just curious, how do we get great parks in, less wealthy areas of New York City when, the parks we think of when we think of great parks like Hudson River Park or Bryant Park or the High Line depend on, bid structures or private concessions or citizens organizations that donate a lot of money to their maintenance. Those things don't seem to be as obvious an option, way out in the Bronx or Queens or Brooklyn. So how do we get these great parks in those places as well that aren't surrounded by wealthy businesses and wealthy people?
There's no real easy answer, but in some cities, and I'm not saying this is easily transferable to the great New York, but healthcare insurance and hospitals are supporting parks as part of a health and wellness and weight reduction and diabetes monitoring and blood pressure monitoring. The Cleveland Botanic Garden is now half funded by hospitals because it set up a system of walking and monitoring blood pressure and diabetes testing. So therefore it's seen as a health prevention saving as opposed to a pure park.
And I want to just go back to the housing authority. I think we've got to work with the housing authority. They have assets all over that we could be using.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is too, in this increasingly competitive budget environment, how are we going to demonstrate the value of parks and open space and walkable and bikeable streets? And this study is a step in that direction. And how can we further monetize that? Yeah, it's an interesting question. But this is really encouraging. That it's actually saving the state, the city money when people are getting active and enjoying their parks. How can we inject that back into the park system? Because the conservancy model, as great as it is, doesn't work everywhere, and it's an increasingly competitive environment for those private donors.
And healthcare in Brooklyn is one of, if not the biggest industry. I think that's a really, really interesting idea. Question here?
My name is Ravi. I actually live in London. Just walked in today. The interesting thing about business downtowns today in many cities across the world is that it's not just one central business district, but they're moving. In London, you have the city, you have Canary Wharf, and you have Heathrow. And in many other cities as well. Whereas in New York, it's traditionally been Wall Street, that's it. And then you have something in and around Fifth Avenue, Times Square. What is the possibility of having a financial CBD in the Bronx? If you are talking about changing Bronx for the better over a 20-year time frame, it's not going to happen in one generation. But if it's going to happen over a period of time, you need to bring in high quality, high value economic activity. And that's one way of decongesting New York. That's one way of getting people to move to other parts, other boroughs. And it's also one way of making those boroughs safer by bringing in economic value add, high quality living, working, people, whatever. Can the government, organizations like yourself, concerned individuals, the financial services industry, which is a huge vested interest, even think in these lines of moving away into the Bronx, let's say. Let's not talk about easy options like other parts of Manhattan or maybe across the bridge into Queens or Brooklyn, but into this unfortunately benighted area, which has been like that for years and years and years. Over the next 20 years, can we make this happen in New York? Can that happen?
Great question.
Well, Cisco Systems is in the business worldwide of selling information and wiring services to new communities. So therefore, maybe the Clinton Global Initiative and Cisco can be part of a planning team that would take a look at that interesting suggestion.
Hi, Olympia Kasi from Van Allen Institute. And I don't know if I qualify as a New Yorker because I lived 18 years in Greece, 11 in Italy, and 6 only in New York. But I am planning to become a New Yorker sooner or later. And I think there is a political problem that I read in the happiness index that I would want to address more with you. That is, if you have a more and more polarized society, if you have the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, these people are not going to be happy. I mean, if there is a disappearance of middle class that is happening throughout the world today, we should address that because that's where happiness, I think, resides. And so, I mean, I'm more European than American for sure, even though I may become a New Yorker. So my thing about social politics and about how philanthropy has a very important role in the United States, but at the same time, there are some things that we cannot leave in individual initiative. So I think that MAS should advocate for a happiness tax in New York City, where basically all our, richer neighborhoods, I don't know, in the Manhattan neighborhoods, instead of giving only for their own selves within the business improvement district's vehicle, we give also 1 or 2% that goes for the business improvement districts of the areas that they don't have business yet. But I do think that we should be talking in political terms.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm going to take the next question
Yes.
also, and then go on. We've got about 2 minutes. We're at the 2-minute warning.
I'll be quick. My name is Robin Nagel. I teach at NYU, and I wanted to take issue with 2 statements in the last part of the presentation, that Manhattan is home to the wealthy, and that the dog waste problem has been conquered. If you live, they are linked. If you live north of 125th Street, it's not the Manhattan that is generally referred to when people talk about, well, Manhattan has these cultural riches and these great resources, and north of 125th, it's many communities of color and many communities where English is not the first language. And it's often left out of most of these kinds of conversations. So I just wanted to remind you that there's 100 some odd blocks north that are in a very different situation, including the parks. North of 125th to the GWB is a world-class park, but if you hold still on a weekday afternoon, the rats are an extraordinary phenomenon. If you have any curiosity about rats as a species, that's a good place to study them. Not true with the Hudson River Park from 59th Street south. So that's my 2 minutes. Thank you.
That's a great point, and I think, I think we'd all love to make more, finer-grained neighborhood-level data. And Citizens Committee for New York, they poll neighborhoods, and you see pretty wide disparities neighborhood to neighborhood within a particular borough. So I think that's an important distinction.
Okay, one last very quick question.
Brief question.
Comment.
With regards to land use in terms of horizontal and vertical spaces, of course, and especially in Manhattan, commercially speaking, do any of the panelists feel as if there's a future where parks are more or less institutionalized within vertical buildings so as to accommodate the needs of residents quicker? We look at economic benefits and quality of life. Is there a future where residents, are more in tune with the New York Minute and not they're stressed about their daily lives so much?
So I was having lunch with a residential housing developer a couple weeks ago, and he was lamenting the fact that the city forces him basically to build tons of parking with his residential developments in downtown Brooklyn. And if you go to these developments that are open and are almost full, you will see cavernous empty parking lots that were built at great expense to the developer. So why not change the zoning code so that that money is instead put in livability enhancements instead of parking, which no one's using, and if they were using it, all those extra cars wouldn't be really enhancing anyone's livability. So,
Thank you. We're out of time. I want to thank Vin and MAS and the Rockefeller Foundation for this opportunity to really ask these questions. And just keep in mind, this is a livability survey, not a happiness survey specifically, but the results are really interesting. We continue to dig down and see how we can solve these problems. Thank you all very much. Thank you to the panel.